that if you don't have some notion of the transcendent, if you don't have some notion of the divine, then you believe any damn thing.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's right.
And that's what the kids are doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dostoevsky's comment on that was, if there's no God, everything is permitted. You know, and he did a lovely job of analyzing that in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. And I think it's true. I think if you believe nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I really do believe that's the case. And, you know, you might say, well, what do you mean? You mentioned earlier that people like to ask me if I believe in God. And I always think, well, who are you to be asking that question? First of all, you have some notion of what you mean by believe that you think is just accurate because you know what believe means. And so you have a priori theory about belief. And now you're asking me if my belief in God fits into your a priori theory. It's how about we start by questioning your a priori theory of belief? Because I don't even know what you mean by believe, and neither do you. Especially when you have that mean look. Profound. Because, you know, do you believe in God? There's two mysteries there, or three. You believe God. All three of those are subject to question. I think people act out what they believe. And so when people ask me if I believe in God, I say generally that I act as if God exists. Or I try to act as if God exists. And they're not very happy about that because they want me to abide by the implicit rules of their question, which is do you believe in the religious view as a pseudo-scientific description of the structure of reality?
Do I need to see something?
I don't even know how to answer that question because it's so badly formulated I can't get a handle on it. Do you believe that there's something divine? Well, let's try to define divine. Here, we can do that for a moment. Most of us have some sense that literary stories differ in their depth. I don't think that's an unwarranted proposition. Some stories are shallow, and some stories are deep. Some stories are ephemeral, and some move you deeply. Whatever that means, it's a metaphor, but we understand what it means. Imagine there are layers of literary depth. And one way of conceptualizing the layers of literary depth is that the deeper an idea is, the more other ideas depend on it. And so you have fundamental ideas that are fundamental because if you shape that idea, you shape all the ideas that are dependent on it. And then I would say, well, the realm of the divine is the realm of the most fundamental ideas. And you don't get to believe in that or not, because the alternative is to say, well, all ideas are equal in value. Okay, well, try acting then. And you can't, because you can't act unless you prioritize your beliefs. And if you prioritize them, you arrange them into a hierarchy. And if you arrange them into a hierarchy, you accept the notion of death. And so that's a no-go.
They don't like that theory.
When we use language of the divine, we're talking about the deepest ideas. And so I believe that the notion that each individual is characterized by a consciousness that transforms the horizon of the future into the present, that's a divine idea. It's so deep. And our cultures necessarily, I think functional cultures are necessarily predicated on that idea. So I don't just think it's a Western idea. I don't think you can have a functional culture that in some sense doesn't instantiate that idea, because you interfere with the mechanism of adaptation itself by not allowing it free expression. You know, and you can be like my prime minister and you can say, well, I really admire the Chinese Communist Party because when it comes to environmental issues, they get things done. And I think I couldn't begin to tell you how many things are wrong with that statement. It would take 15 years to tell you why you're
he urinated on
inexcusably narcissistic idiot. But we can start like simply. If you know what you're doing and you have power, if you know what you're doing, maybe you can be more efficient.
What's wrong?
In your exercise in your control over movement towards that goal. Let's just assume for a minute that you do know what you're doing. Well, maybe if you have power, then you're efficient. Fair enough, man. What about when you don't know what you're doing? How about then? Where do you turn? Because what that means is your ideology failed you. And do you have a mechanism for operating when you don't know what you're doing? Well, no, because we always know what we're doing because we're totalitarian. We have a complete theory of everything. And don't say anything to the contrary or else. We've got it all wrapped up. Yeah, except when you don't. And so what do we do in free societies when we don't know what we're doing? Well, we let people talk. And out of that babble, out of that noise, and American culture is particularly remarkable in this regard, you have this immense diversity of opinions, most of which are completely useless, and some of which are absolutely redemptive. And one of the things that's so remarkable as a Canadian observing your culture in particular is that, you know, you guys veer off in weird directions fairly frequently and things look pretty unstable. And then there's some glimmer of hope somewhere that bursts forward in a whole new mode of adaptation, and away you go again. And that just happens over and over and over. And that's a consequence of real diversity, And it's definitely a consequence of freedom of association and freedom of speech, because it enables all that.
He's focused, right?
That's optimistic. And I always like to end the show on an up note here, but I'm not quite ready to end the show yet. So I want to hold that, I'll put a pin in the optimism. You mentioned Trudeau and Trudeau's admiration for the Chinese Communist Party. Ray Dalio, billionaire. On China, empires rise when they're productive, financially sound, earn more than they spend, and increase assets faster than their liabilities. Objectively, compare China and the U.S. on these measures, and the fundamentals clearly favor China. Close quote. Now, this is Jordan Peterson writing about communism in your introduction to the 50th anniversary edition of the Gulag Archipelago. The 50th anniversary of the publication of that in the West takes place next year. Jordan Peterson. No political experiment has been tried so widely, with so many disparate people, in so many different countries, and failed so absolutely and catastrophically. How much proof do we need? Why do we still avert our eyes from the truth? Now, I have one, I'm setting this up because this next quotation I think is actually quite beautiful, and I really want to see what you do with it. Ray Dalio is voice to this persistent temptation. Jordan Peterson says, why? Why do we still feel tempted? And Dostoevsky, in The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor is speaking to Christ. And he says to Christ, you all know. Receiving their bread from us, the people will clearly see that we take the bread from them to give it back to them. And they will be only too glad to have it so, as we will deliver them from their greatest anxiety and torture, that of having to decide freely for themselves. Never was there anything more unbearable to the human race than personal freedom. Close quote. It's too hard. Dr. Peterson, it's just too hard. Canada had a good run. The United States had a good run. But sustaining free societies across the decades and across the generations is just too hard for human nature to bear. No, you're not supposed to agree with that.
Well, two things. You know, the first thing is that man does not live by bread alone. So that's the first rejoinder. And the second is, with regards to difficulty, well, the only thing more difficult than contending forthrightly with existence is failing to do so. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this isn't difficult. I mean, part of what the Western religious tradition has done, and religious traditions in general, to some degree, is to try to provide people with support from what's divine in their incalculably difficult efforts to deal with the unknown. Let's say the unknown.
So loving.
You know, that if you orient yourself ethically in the most fundamental sense, then in some sense you have the force of God on your side, and then maybe you can prevail despite the difficulty. And I think that's
Didn't she get a bag of dog food?
I think it's.
I think
that's true. So, and you can ask yourself. I try to ask these questions seriously, you know, and I would also say that I've been driven to my religious belief, such as it is, by necessity, not by desire. What do you want to have on your side when you're contending with the unknowable future and its vagaries? How about truth? How about beauty? How about justice? You want allies? Those are powerful allies. That's what the university is supposed to be teaching young people. It's like, you need some allies, man. Well, how about the pursuit of truth? Well, then the scientists have their say. And I would say on the economic front, well, how about the free trade between autonomous individuals? The free trade of goods of value between autonomous individuals. That's not such a bad thing to have on your side. These eternal verities. And then we could say,
No,
perhaps,
no.
well, there is a set of eternal
No
verities,
fighting.
but they're
They're
all
gonna drink. They're gonna
eternal
drink water.
verities, so they share something in common. Some good
No,
in common.
Phoenix.
All good things share some good in common.
It's a
Well, what is
Phoenix.
the good that they share in common? Well, for all intents and purposes, that's God. And you might say, well, I don't believe in that. It's like, well, I don't know what you mean. You don't believe there's any such thing as good? You don't believe there's any such thing as ultimate good? I'm not trying to make some ontological claim about an old man living in the sky, although I think that's a lot more sophisticated concept than people generally realize. That's not my point. My point is you do have a belief system, whether you know it or not. It's a system of ethics, whether you know it or not. There's either something at the bottom that unifies it, or it's not unified, which means you're aimless and hopeless and depressed and anxious and confused, because those are the only other options. And maybe you don't know what that unifying belief is, but that doesn't mean that it's not
cute.
there. It just means you don't know what it is.
Me chuchu baby.
And so I'm trying to puzzle out what it is. You know, I could give you a couple of examples, very, very briefly, because I won't. So I already mentioned the Genesis, the story in Genesis. It associates God with the force process that generates habitable order out of chaos and attributes that nature in some sense to human beings. In the next part of the story, in the story of Adam and Eve, God is what people walk with unself-consciously in the garden. So Adam doesn't, because he's now ashamed and he doesn't walk with God anymore. But so what is God? Well, that's what you walk with when you're unself-conscious. So that's an interesting idea. And then you have the God that manifests himself, let's say, in the story of Noah, and that's the intuition that hard times are coming and that you better get your house in order. And you think, well, does that lead you to that intuition? Well, certainly sometimes, if you have any sense, it's like, well, what's the nature of the intuition? Is that a spirit that animates you? Well, obviously, because there you are acting, and so you're acting out a pattern. It's a spirit that animates you. And so, and then there's the story of the Tower of Babel. What's God there? Well, God is that which you replace at your peril.
He peed on the bed.
Because everything will come tumbling down. That's the Tower of Babel. It's like, well, is that true or not?
Mijo, but not right now.
Especially
Just like
in that light, you think, well,
a few minutes
definitely,
ago.
if we put the wrong thing at the top, like Stalin, for example, then look out. And we've done that a bunch of times in the 20th century. I think, Milton conceptualized Lucifer as something like the spirit of unbridled intellectual arrogance. It's something like Lucifer's the light bringer. And he is engaged in a conflict with God, attempting to replace the divine. And that's pretty explicit in the story. And I look at that and I think, oh, that's a poetic intuition of the battle between the secular intelligentsia and the religious structure. That's Milton's prodroma. And what he sees happening is the intellect has become so arrogant that it will attempt to replace the divine and rule over hell. I think, that's the Soviet Union, man. That's Maoist China. We know. We've got our theory. It's total. We've solved the problem and nothing's going to change. Fair enough. If you want to rule over hell, and you think, well, these societies are successful. It's a pretty odd definition of success as far as I'm concerned. You want to be successful like China? That's why it's true that man does not live by bread alone. A wealthy slave, that's no life, man.
Last question. And again, I'm going to take a moment to set this up. And I'm going to fumble. I'm going to grope toward it. I'm going to stumble along toward this question. But I'm finding myself thinking back to the 1970s. Canada's part of this, but I know the American story better. And in the 1970s, everything goes wrong. Economic stagnation, loss of morale in this country because we lose in Vietnam, Watergate scandal. We're on the defensive as the Soviets advance in Africa, Latin America. And then in the 1980s, it all turns. And we go from 1979 and the national humiliation of the Iranian hostage crisis and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to 1989, 1 decade, just 10 years later, the Berlin Wall comes down. So the question here is the loss of freedom of speech, the corruption of the universities, the rise of China, which is in all kinds of ways a more formidable opponent than the Soviet Union was. In all kinds of ways, one could argue that we're in a worse position now than we were in the 70s. And so what I want to know is, are you speaking to those few who have eyes to see and ears to hear? Do you believe that we are capable? Do you hope to prompt another kind of restoration?
You guys lay down.
Or is Jordan Peterson the fascinating, eloquent, compelling champion of a lost cause?
Who's worried right here?
Well, I mean, when I spent a lot of time at the various universities I was associated with studying motivation for atrocity. Because I was very curious about that as a psychologist, not as a sociologist or an economist or a political scientist. You're an Auschwitz guard. Okay, what's motivating you as an individual? And I wanted to understand it well enough so that I could understand how I could do that. Because one answer to that is, well, that sort of behavior is so far beyond the pale that it's completely incomprehensible. It's just a manifestation of, say, like intense psychopathy, and a normal person can't even imagine it. And I think, no, the evidence doesn't really suggest that, because it isn't obvious that all the people involved in the Nazi movement, for example, were criminally pathological, that they were deviations.
Pathological?
Incomprehensible deviations from the norm. It'd be lovely to think that, and it would make the world a lot simpler. But I think the evidence mostly suggests that no, you can get ordinary people to do that sort of thing, and maybe even to enjoy
Phoenix,
it.
what are you maneuvering?
So that's pretty bloody terrifying.
Why you look guilty?
And so I tried to understand that, and I think I did to some degree, although we can't go into that. A fair bit of that's a consequence of envy. It's the spirit of Cain, I would say, if you had to sum it up in a phrase. But that isn't the issue. The issue is, how do you stop it from happening again? And because that's supposed to be what we're concentrating on, let's say,